Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. This is the second webinar in our Workplace Parking Levy and Clean Air Zone series, and the last one was late last year on Clean Air Zones, which is on YouTube for you to look at. And we are hoping for later in the year to have a third and final face-to-face conference on both these topics, but fingers crossed on that one. So we have got a really fabulous set of speakers today. So thank you all for the speakers for joining us today. And we've got those creme de la creme of Workplace Parking Levy practitioners and politicians that have been there, done that, and those that would have a scheme in place if it wasn't for COVID-19 and everything that's going on. So, introduce myself. My name is Nick Ruxton-Boyle, and I am Director of Environment for Marston Holdings. Marston Holdings is the largest transport and enforcement organisation in the UK, and we've been advising a number of our local authority clients on workplace levy and other road user charging solutions for them. I'm a transport planner. I worked in local authority for many years before joining the private sector, and I fully understand the challenge that many of us are facing today in terms of the environment and social and economic matters. So, a brief intro from me to start, and then we move straight on to the presentations. And I suppose a warning first, and a workplace parking levy isn't going to be for everyone, not every local authority. Now, this is probably down to a number of things, the local transport geography, the economy and land use. However, it is a very flexible tool, and I'm sure a lot of us on today's webinar do know a reasonable amount about workplace levies. And I just want to touch on three main reasons in which one would want to consider a workplace levy alongside other transport policy interventions. And these are not new reasons since the 2000 Act brought in the legislation, but many of them have evolved and changed priority and moved way up the political agenda in the last 5 years, and even more so in the last year. First and number one is climate change, and we're all well aware of the current situation with greenhouse gases and legislation and the policy framework. And many of us on the webinar today are from local authorities who are planning their net zero plans, their action plans, their pathways to net zero from anywhere between 2030 and 2050. And a workplace levy is a good tool to assist there. Some of you may have seen that Friends of the Earth have released their climate action plan, and the very top action on their list is a workplace parking levy. So that's really good way of achieving some of your climate action goals. The second is air pollution, and we all know the situation with current court cases and the trend in air pollution and travel, and whether it's NOx or particulate matters under the new Environment Bill, workplace levy is a tool to reduce traffic and to achieve mode shift, which again is all part of the air pollution toolbox that we have as practitioners. And it targets specific peak time trip, and it's got equity built into it in that the polluters are paying for those journeys. And finally, it's a budget planning and budget management. Now, I've worked in and around local authorities for 20 years and always had financial challenges across that period with budgets reducing and bigger demands on local authority finances. And workplace levy is one of those rare tools that are easily budget positive, and it can generate, ring-fenced revenue to invest in transport infrastructure and solution. And over the last year, the impact of COVID-19 has decimated local and national finances for that matter. So it's really brings workplace levy solution to the forefront in terms of how to build better, to build the government in terms of what we do to get back to some sort of normality. Right, that's enough from me. Let's get on to the experts. And first up, we have Sir Peter Soulsby, who is the Mayor of Leicester. And without further ado, I'll hand over to Peter. Peter, yours.
first of all, thanking the organisers for this. It's an opportunity to talk about something that's very high on our agenda here in Leicester. A couple of words of introduction first. Obviously, I'm speaking as the city mayor in Leicester. We're one of the just a handful of local authorities that have a directly elected mayor in a unitary authority. Bristol, Liverpool, Salford being probably the only other significantly sized authorities that have the similar system. And obviously, when looking at developing something like this, perhaps it's a talk for a different day, but the advantage of having a directly elected mayor is something that does enable us to drive this forward. If I could just take on to the next slide and just perhaps give a little bit of context. Obviously, my presentation is essentially the policy element. Others will be talking later about the practice of the implementation of a WPL. But a bit about Leicester. We're obviously a large urban area, but one that is essentially standing alone. We're not part of a metropolitan area where we have around us a significantly rural county with some large market towns and tight boundaries around the city, and the need to work quite closely with the county council on a number of issues. And they've been very collaborative on this, although made it quite clear that a workplace parking levy is something that is a risk for me to take politically in the city and not something that they're particularly signed up to. There's a lot of growth planned for the area. We've got significant growth in homes in the next decade, and of course, like everybody else, are beginning to face up to the challenges of climate change, the challenges of health, and the air quality challenges. And of course, like everybody else, we're facing up at the present time to what COVID-19 means, both now and in the recovery period beyond. Just take on to my next slide. Since I was elected first as mayor some 10 years ago, we've I think come a long way in terms of investing in what I've described as a Connecting Leicester project, investing already over £100 million in joining up previously unconnected areas of retail and cultural areas in the city, and particularly improving facilities for cyclists and pedestrians in the city centre. We've responded during those 10 years to the challenges of the air quality, and I'll perhaps give a couple of figures later on as to the effectiveness of that. But we've certainly set out to support sustainable travel and to limit emissions. We've got extensive cycling and walking action plans and some ambitious targets, and have been enormously helped by our £70 million Transforming Cities programme, which that rather fussy illustration sets out, which is based on a hub and spoke concept, creating sustainable traffic corridors from the city centre out to the suburban areas. Of course, like everybody else, COVID has brought its challenges, but it has given us, at least, the unexpected opportunity to boost cycling and walking numbers. And we were one of the very first to prepare a transport recovery plan to take advantage of this. If you can move on to the next slide, what we're now building is on those plans to prepare an ambitious local transport plan over the next 15 years to associate it with funding from a workplace parking levy to make it deliverable. I've illustrated here just a few of the things that we've already managed to achieve. The very significant development of civilized spaces within the city centre, and our commitment to the air quality action plan. And here I refer to the figures. We've seen a recorded drop of NO2 levels from a previous 60 micrograms per metre cubed in 2015 down to 36 now. And that obviously is something that we're very proud of, and pleased to say that it does make us compliant now. If you just move to the next slide, as part of what we're already doing, we are currently redeveloping our St Margaret's bus station to be carbon neutral, which understandably the first such facility in the country to achieve it, and rolling out electric bike shares, which, were it not for COVID, would be up and running by now, and installing these across the city centre and indeed beyond. And I've included just at the bottom there an image of what we have been able to do during COVID, and that's just a small selection of it. I set the target of doing a mile of new cycleway per week, and we managed to achieve that quite readily. That happens to be in the city centre, and it's a cycleway that enables both cyclists and pedestrians, but also when we're able to do it, cafe outside seating. We just move on to the next slide. Our local transport plan, which, as I've said, sets out the vision for the next 15 years, does contain a number of core areas of focus, and it will serve as an enabler for exploring the introduction of the Workplace Parking Levy. And the two are very closely interlinked, because what we say about the parking levy has got to include what we say we are doing with the revenue from it, and it's got to be an ambitious and an exciting prospect, and I believe it is. The buses there are the electric buses that I believe are somewhere en route from China at the moment, and hopefully they will arrive, and when people can again travel more freely, they'll find that they've got a new and literally green alternative. So as I come towards the end of the time I've got, I just want to say how much gratitude we have here in Leicester to our neighbours in Nottingham, because they will be speaking in a few moments about the issues surrounding the implementation of the Workplace Parking Levy. And I'll just say they have been enormously helpful. As you may imagine, there is often a friendly rivalry between the two larger cities in the East Midlands. Leicester, of course, being the largest city in the East Midlands, I often remind them. But nonetheless, this is one occasion when we have something to learn from our neighbours. And I'm very grateful for the fact that they've been so willing to engage with us and to help us to learn from their experience. Obviously, we're also keen to work with other local authorities and the Department of Transport, and I know there are a number on this seminar today, and we have got a working group with others, and I think the second meeting of that is this month, and we're very grateful for being able to be part of that wider participation. If we turn to the next slide and just say that I think it's certainly my view, from all of our discussions with within that group and with Nottingham, that the Workplace Parking Levy will work best when there's a clear focus on the projects that will be made possible from it. And I think as I say, the link between it and our plans for the future are ones that we really do need to emphasise. Obviously, in Nottingham's case, there is the clear link to a tram. That's not felt by us in Leicester to be the appropriate route for us, but we have identified 3 emerging focal projects. We'll be working with Network Rail, DFT and the train operators on the station scheme. We'll have high quality buses that are tram-like on express routes, rather than to a tram per se. And finally, if I just turn to my last slide, we'll just say that, of course, COVID does somewhat get in the way of perhaps taking things forward in the timescale that we had originally envisaged, but I don't want it to get in the way very significantly. And we are looking towards consultation on the transport plan in its draft form and the Workplace Parking Levy together in the May-June period, looking to November, December for formal consultation, to a submission of the business case to the Secretary of State in the early part of next year, and then with the intention of actually getting the Workplace Parking Levy operational in 2023, which incidentally, well, perhaps not entirely coincidentally, is my next election year. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you for that, Peter. And a quick question from me before we do move on to the Nottingham example and experience. Is there anything specific about Leicester, Leicester City, that lends itself to a workplace levy other than other solutions that I know we as practitioners have available to achieve some of your environmental targets and ambitions?
I think there are some things, and I referred to them in passing earlier on. We are at the heart of a predominantly rural county with almost like satellites around the city, a series of market towns. And it does mean that we are monocentric as a county, which perhaps avoids some of the complications that others have where they are part of a larger conurbation. And where there are perhaps a number of different centres, and where there is perhaps more need to collaborate with neighbours in the introduction of a workplace parking levy, which is not to say that it's impossible to do it in those circumstances. It just means challenges are different. For us, I think the perhaps major challenge is that our boundaries are so tightly drawn, and the county, for very understandable reasons, not an integrated part of a workplace parking levy introduction scheme. While we can collaborate with them, they can't be a part of it. So there are negatives as well as positives, but I think the overwhelming positive is that we're at the heart of the county.
Sure, absolutely. Thanks for that, and thank you for your presentation, Peter. I would mention to all our attendees before we move on that if you look at your side panel, we do have a question box. So at any point during the 4 presentations we have this morning, please do drop your questions into that box, and we will get through them as well as we can at the Q&A with all our panelists later on this morning. But without further ado, we'll move on to our second presenter, which is Nigel Hallam. And Nigel is the Workplace Parking Levy Service Manager at Nottingham City Council, who's been operating the scheme now for many years. So look forward to hearing, Nigel, about how you've adapted and flexed the scheme over the last year or so. Over to you, Nigel.
Thank you very much, Nick. It's great to be here, and just to add to Peter's comment, I do remember him telling myself and Jason Goodin probably 18 months or so ago that the WPL was the only thing that Nottingham's got better than Leicester, which that's perhaps a point for wider discussion on another day, so Peter, once we've started with your levy in Leicester. Nottingham WPL scheme is now in its 9th year, as Nick said, so we're a very mature scheme. So what I've been asked to do is focus on our journey and the future rather than the mechanics of the scheme. So this is a brand new presentation. I've been speaking about the levy for quite a number of years now, so it probably is time for a really good refresh. So any feedback on this presentation is greatly received. I will talk a little bit, if we move on to the first slide, or the proper slide please, about a little bit of the background. So where did we start? Back in 2007, Atkins did a major report for the city. It said the cost of congestion was £160 million a year. Over half of that cost was borne by businesses directly in terms of delays to the supply chain. Like Leicester, we're a very tightly bounded city. We have 3 million commuters potentially within 1 hour's journey time from Nottingham. And unsurprisingly, 70% of peak period congestion is commuter traffic. Back in the late noughties, congestion was forecast to grow by 15% by 2021. So real action was needed to prevent the local economy choking going forward. We're an ambitious city. We've had some very ambitious politicians, very ambitious for transport particularly, and it's often been said we've got the best public transport system outside of London. However, we still wanted to have more attractive solutions and alternatives to the car. We wanted to develop high quality, affordable transport. We wanted to protect the city's economy for obvious reasons. And obviously, we wanted to improve the environment and the general sustainability of the city. And all that is in the context of a massively shrinking funding coming from central government. So it posed a lot of real challenges. Next slide, please, Mark. So WPL is a radical idea. Fundamentally, what is it? It's a demand management tool. It disincentivises employers by placing a modest charge on their supply of free parking, fundamentally to staff. The charge is currently £424 per place. That rises to £428 on the 1st of April this year. One of the key things about the levy, though, is that all the money raised has to be used to be invested into local transport projects. And that was a real strong selling point when we did engage with businesses who quite understandably wanted everything that the levy would deliver, but they just didn't necessarily want to pay for it. So we've come a long way over the last 8 or 9 years. We've now got 53% of liable car parking places subject to a car park management scheme where the actual vehicle user pays the levy in whole or part. There's some really sort of clever schemes as to how to have a car park management scheme. The University of Nottingham, for example, they have a scheme based on the midpoint of salary, but because they're a university with a very, very green agenda, it also is linked in with carbon emissions of vehicles. So you might have the highest earner who drives an electric vehicle, their cost for their parking comes down. You might have a lower paid employee who drives a 40-year-old Range Rover V8 that leaves a cloud of black smoke behind it. They're going to pay more. Some organisations, particularly in the manufacturing sector, have said to their workforce, if you meet the organisation's carbon emissions targets this year, we will absorb the cost of the levy for you. And some have even encouraged doing charitable work, bearing the tabard of their organisation on it, and they will pay their levy for them. So there's some really, really clever ways of promoting the levy and offsetting the cost. Next one, please. So the changing physical environment is leading to a changing political climate. You know, Sir Peter quite rightly alluded to the challenges of climate change, and all authorities are now facing the challenge of improving air quality. But the real question is, how do they raise the finance to do so? The WPL scheme is attracting, you know, massive awareness in the UK, but also internationally. Myself and Jason Goodin have led on delivering consultancy advice and guidance to a capital city in the Southern Hemisphere. We've also had the chance to talk about the Workplace Parking Levy through a government initiative with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and we're speaking to South America and Indian cities as well. So it really is being considered, where even Sir Peter might admit that a few years ago he said we're not going to have a levy in Leicester. Now he's actually 100% supportive of it, and it's going to deliver the fantastic ambitions he's got for the citizens of Leicester. You know, whilst air quality wasn't necessarily at the forefront of Nottingham's objectives when we introduced it in the early part of 2020 onwards, what it's done is certainly delivered environmental objectives. The fact that we've managed to electrify our public transport network through trams and electric buses, it's enabled Nottingham to become the first local authority to have its air quality management plan signed off central government. And the key point of that success is it's without the need for a charging clear air zone that some authorities are doing. So there's much greater awareness of poor air quality, and there's a recognition at political levels and the climate emergency is very, very important. And Nottingham declared its ambition to be carbon neutral as a city by 2028. But also I'm sensing a greater upswell of public opinion in support of the politicians and the leaders to do something about poor air quality for generations to come. And I personally think that's going to be lead to a greater acceptance of the WPL scheme. Again, Sir Peter in Leicester is really, really keen to engage the business and business leaders in Leicester, and the early meetings that have been, I would say, generally positive, far more positive than we had in Nottingham when we were going through this as the pioneers. Next slide, please. So where are we now? You know, it's actually been a fantastic success. We've generated £75 million worth of new revenue since the scheme started. We've had 100% compliance of liable employers since the first year of the scheme, and we've never fell below 100%. Out of £75 million, we've collected it all except £10,000 that's had to be written off for bad debt. So we've got a debt collection rate of greater than 99.9%. And all that in the context of a very much a compliance-centred approach. We will wrap our arms around employers, we will support them, we will guide them, we can give them as much assistance as we can. We've got a workplace travel service that offers travel journey planning, it offers car park management advice, and it offers money in terms of grants that are now match funded by the employer to deliver cycle infrastructure, not just cycle shelters, but drying rooms and other facilities for cyclists and other users of active travel modes. And we've done that at less than 5% of revenue. The WPL is a licensing scheme. It requires no major infrastructure investment, and the operating costs are very, very efficient compared with other types of congestion charge. The levy had a subject of a thorough, independent and rigorous academic evaluation conducted by Dr. Simon Dale and Professor Stephen Ison, then of Leicester, now at the Montfort University, who is indeed involved in the Leicester project. And some of the key findings and outcomes of that academic exercise was the levy has had a constraining effect on congestion growth. We have seen mode shift, but most importantly, perhaps from a political perspective and a business perspective, the levy has not been a disincentive, has not impacted on investment in the city. In fact, the contrary, there is evidence to the contrary in that the levy is proving an attractor for business because of the fantastic public transport infrastructure, and it's leading to businesses locating into and relocating into Nottingham, which is fantastic news. Next slide, please. There are challenges. There's fantastic ambition around the UK and internationally. You've heard about Sir Peter's in Leicester. You've also got what the guys in Hounslow, who will be talking later on, are doing, and also in Oxford, to name just 3 in the UK. But the question is really, how do you raise that local revenue? You know, you've got to generate something internally to bring in money from the outside. And WPL will always be a contentious scheme, but the focus on the need to improve air quality, arguably I think, makes it much less contentious than when Nottingham embarked on its scheme. And certainly feedback from business representatives, and this is now from probably 3 or 4 years ago, is that the Nottingham WPL scheme is now seen as business as usual. And when Oxford stated their intention 3 or 4 years ago to consider a WPL, the chair of the Regional Chamber of Commerce was asked for their opinion. And he basically said, well, Nottingham's WPL has delivered what it said on the tin, which is fantastic news. So there's no reason why somebody shouldn't at least consider it and see if the scheme is right for them. Next slide, please. You know, Nottingham's got a huge amount of experience and individual products that we can support other local authorities at every stage of evaluating whether a WPL is appropriate and viable in a particular area. We started off our work for Leicester by doing a feasibility study to see, it's not just saying, well, why are we going to do it? But you've got to go through a process to say, is it right for us and what can it deliver? We've got unique experience of all aspects of the scheme. If you followed the Nottingham WPL model, we firmly believe you would do it very cost effectively, because you know you learn from our experience, and we would do some things differently. You do it at minimal risk, and that's a key thing for the politicians. And again, you've seen Sir Peter's really ambitious timescale. We believe you can do it from start to finish within 1 electoral cycle, and that's really important when you have got perhaps not the same level of political stability that Nottingham has got. We've actually developed a end-to-end WPL licensing system in Nottingham, where all employers are in charge of their own licenses. They can make whatever changes they want throughout the year, and at the back end, the compliance team do everything they need to do through that, and all communications are recorded. That's been really successful. And we've also used the time during the COVID pandemic to sort of be innovative, because you know, certainly Leicester wanted to do a feet on the ground parking survey, but that's blatantly not practical, not least of all because you haven't got the same numbers of cars parking prior to the lockdown. So we've developed a guest-based analytical tool that once data is gathered by the client city, it's matched against the Nottingham database and a very clever algorithm developed by Dr. Simon Dale, who did the WPL evaluation, and it delivers a product which estimates the amount of potential liable workplace parking in the other city. We're delivering that product to our colleagues in Leicester later this week, which they will then use to sort of build on and do some financial planning and some financial forecasting, which is an essential part, because ultimately you've got to submit a financial case to the Secretary of State for Transport. Next stage, please. WPL schemes are very flexible. The Nottingham scheme covers the whole of the administrative boundary, but you don't need to do it, you tailor it to fit. You know, for example, Hounslow, they'll talk about looking at a specific industrial estate. You look at Oxford, they're looking at a big swathe of land across the east of the city. You know, you can look at different charging levels. You know, you don't have to have a flat rate like Nottingham's got. You could have a inner city rate and an outer city rate, for example, or even based on individual sort of areas of industrial or employer population. But what we have got is we've got a wealth of experience that will enable other authorities to use their money wisely to deliver a successful scheme that can at least replicate the success we've had at Nottingham. So we really want folks to talk to us, not just when you're ready to start it and you want to know how we did it. Bring us in right at the early stage, because we'll make you do it efficiently, effectively, which is what everybody wants. So the final stage then is please get in touch. We've got a wealth of experience to bring. We're ready, willing and able to share it. We've developed a three-stage route map, which when it's populated fills in all the different areas that need to be looked at, and that's actually worth its weight in gold, and will certainly support local officers and politicians in terms of presentations and every stage of the WPL project. So myself and Jason Goodin, the original senior project manager on the levy and now the head of parking, fleet and transport in Nottingham, would love to talk to you, and we're looking forward to taking some challenging questions later on this morning. So thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Nigel. Great presentation, and yeah, the new deck works really well. I like it. A quick question for me before we move on. Is there, obviously 9 years in, you know how these things operate, is there any unintended consequences of the scheme that, both good and bad, that those authorities thinking about engaging their members about a scheme need to consider at this stage?
There's nothing been something that's actually fundamentally bad, Nick. One of the unintended consequences that's been very positive is that a guaranteed revenue stream, and even in the middle of a very severe lockdown, we're still delivering many millions of pounds through the Workplace Parking Levy. That almost guaranteed revenue stream has enabled the Nottingham City Council to sort of match fund, to take advantage of prudential borrowing, which is why we've delivered £200 million for our electric bus fleet. There's a lot of questions now, would you have the same discounts, for example, that Nottingham had? And I'll just throw it out there as a very contentious thing, and this is from somebody whose mother was a midwife and did a working life in the NHS. We give 100% discount to the NHS in Nottingham. The NHS are the largest provider of workplace parking. They generate a multi-million-pound revenue stream from parking. So their staff are contributing to congestion, contributing to poor air quality, but at the moment they don't pay the levy. That's the real question, I think, for everybody going forward, because the cost on the NHS, and I'm doing a lot of research around it to present a paper, is it right that the NHS are exempted? But massively contentious, and it's going to be a brave politician who goes there, but that's a big learning point, because it's a massive revenue stream for WPL for all the right reasons.
It is. Thanks, Nigel. I'm sure we'll pick that up at the Q&A later. Right. Thank you so much for your presentation. Right then, moving on. Nigel mentioned Hounslow. So next up, we've got a couple of colleagues from Hounslow who have been developing their workplace levy scheme for a number of years now, and probably would have had it in place if it wasn't for the pandemic. So I'm going to hand over to Mark Frost. Mark is the director of Fern Consulting and previous head of transport at Hounslow. Mark, over to you.
Thank you, Nick. Hopefully people can see me and hear me. From some couple of connection problems here. Okay, can you go straight to the next slide, please? So yes, my name's Mark Frost. I'm director of Fern Consulting Services Limited. However, up until the end of last year, I was assistant director for transport, parking and environmental strategy at London Borough of Hounslow, and I was project director for the workplace parking levy proposal there. So I'm going to say a few words about the background to the scheme and about why we'd gone down this route of exploring a WPL, and particularly a WPL for a small part of a borough that makes up one part of the whole of London. There are different contexts to Leicester and Nottingham. And then I'm going to hand over to Harris Vallianatos, who is the lead project officer at Hounslow, leading the project and has for a couple of years. I will talk you through a little bit more of the detail, particularly reflecting on the impact of COVID. So first of all, what is it we're actually proposing? So we're looking at a work parking levy in a relatively small area on the Great West Road in Brentford. So this is a part of an opportunity area that was defined in the Mayor's London plan and also in our local plan, and it's due to take a significant proportion of our growth, 17,500 jobs and 7,500 homes. However, there's a problem. The transport is poor. P-TOW level that we to measure public transport accessibility in London is 1, 2, 3 at best, all of which are incredibly low levels of public transport accessibility. And a study that we did back in 2015-16 suggested that actually the highway network was close to capacity at various points, and actually could probably only accommodate about 1,200 new jobs in the area, so a very, very long way away from where we want it to be. So we've undertaken a whole raft of different strategies and scoping exercises to understand what we need to do to improve transport in that area, and it's come up with a range of schemes, including what we call a cross-rail extension or Elizabeth line extension, bringing a shuttle service that will run between this development site, this opportunity, up to Southall, which will be an Elizabeth line station, hopefully from next year. And a raft of other improvements, including walking, cycling, and bus-based improvements, including something that looks like a quality bus corridor along the A4. All of that price tag of £100 million, and there is very little funding available for that in London. There was a great deal of funding available beforehand. It may surprise those who are from London and think that the streets are paved with gold, but there's even less money now. That's particularly because of the pandemic, but also the levelling up agenda. So we were very much interested in trying to be able to be masters of our own destiny, to be able to have funding available to implement these schemes that weren't us going in hand to the Treasury or to the DfT. We looked at a raft of different ways that we could fund this. So we looked at a business rate retention scheme, not dissimilar to the Nine Elms Northern Line extension in Battersea. We looked at what we could do with strategic sale, Section 106. We even looked at council tax precepts. But none of those things got us really anywhere near £100 million, although they did make contributions to our ability to prudentially borrow. So a workplace parking levy really was the only way forward. And I think there was also some very specific context for this particular corridor. So we had that really important that was very real and was very different, a step change in public transport accessibility for the corridor that we could link WPL to.
I'm going to concentrate a little bit more on the impact of COVID. This is an outline of the process that we're following. We're in the middle of preparing our business case. And just a warning that some of this is London specific, so this process may not work for other parts of the country. We estimate that we've had approximately a 1-year delay due to COVID. I think that won't surprise anyone. However, the reason for that delay is not that resources have been allocated elsewhere, but is because of an inability to engage with businesses at this time because they are so sensitive around what is happening at the moment. We've also found that there are 3 main challenges that COVID have put in our path to completing our business case and submitting our case, well, eventually to the Secretary of State and the Mayor of London. They are, how do we refactor our strategic and economic cases in the light of the changes that have been happening, and which of those changes are going to be long term? How do we adapt our transport package to cope with the changes that we now expect? And exactly how are we going to engage with businesses at a time when they are particularly sensitive? So next slide, please. So we've seen large short-term effects across the country due to COVID, and they have impacted transport mostly on the demand side. I think we've all seen the figures, the national figures from the DfT as to what's happened to transport, and we've all seen in the press how many people are now doing online shopping. In Hounslow, one of the anecdotal figures that we have from our businesses is that during December we were seeing occupied parking levels of about 30%, and obviously in December we didn't have the full lockdown that we have now. So we are seeing, the potential for medium-term effects being very significant. In the longer term, the effects are uncertain, and the big question for us is, can we predict the level of economic growth, the level of development that we're going to see within the WPL area? Can we predict the travel demand, home working, internet retail, and the modal preferences? I think we have a lot of conflicting evidence as to modal preferences. You may have seen stories in the press from motoring organisations that we are falling in love with the car again because it keeps us away from other people. But you may also have seen stories about how we're falling in love with cycling again. And really, we need stronger data than we have at the moment to be able to predict properly. So Hounslow's response within the business case, what have we decided to do? Well, really, we've decided to change the narrative of our strategic case to highlight the benefits of a WPL as they relate to a post-COVID world. So there'll be more of an emphasis on air quality, and there'll be more of an emphasis on how we can support active travel using a WPL. To reflect that future uncertainty, because we don't think we're going to have an answer to exactly what those long-term effects are, certainly not in the next 6 to 12 months, although we probably will have more data. We're going to use a scenario-based approach. Now, I don't think anyone will be surprised by that. Certainly in our economic modelling, we're going to use a range of scenarios to reflect likely positions. And perhaps most importantly, as we know, WPL is linked very strongly, the income from it is linked very strongly to the parking levels within an area. Well, we've reworked our parking growth forecasts in the light of COVID, and generally they are more pessimistic to reflect the fact that we do think there will be higher levels of home working. We think that home working attitudes will have a long tail. So actually in the long term, we may well return to almost normal levels, but there is going to be a permanent change. What that percentage change will be, we're not sure at the moment. The transport package, the package of improvements that we're going to spend the money on, we are adapting that within the business case as well. We think that travellers will need or will desire more flexibility and choice. And because of that, we are now proposing an incremental approach. We are looking for quick wins within the active travel arena, and also new express bus services, which we can implement relatively quickly. And then in the medium term, looking to implement our bigger projects, such as our new rail link to Crossrail at Southall. Stakeholder engagement, and it's fair to say that this is an area which has caused us issues and delayed the project. Our old approach really was based on our best practice, which was, regular and frequent engagement with businesses, taking them on the journey with us as we developed the plans for the WPL. And what we found is that businesses at the moment, certainly, and in the near future, have less time, less money, and are extremely sensitive to change throughout the organisation at both board level and middle management level. We've also found that they are potentially less likely to pay the charge on behalf of their employees. Nottingham have some great stats which they might be able to share in the Q&A as to how many of their businesses are likely to be paying the charge for their employees. But based on our conversations so far, we think that they are now less likely to pay the charge. And remember that maybe in the long term you might say, well, that may be the case in the short term, but maybe not in the long term. Well, they have to commit to passing on the charge at the beginning of implementing WPL. So it's unlikely they're going to change that position as we go on. Perhaps slightly differently, we think there is latent demand for parking in our area, in the Great West Corridor. I would encourage anyone who is thinking about doing a parking survey to speak to their businesses about the demand they think is in the background as well, because latent demand can have a huge effect on WPL, because as companies may decide to take away parking, to reduce their WPL levy, But if there's latent demand for parking, you might find that employees start to move out into residential areas and have other undesirable effects. So what are we doing? Well, we're implementing a new multi-phase approach based on actually talking to businesses one-to-one, interviews, and trying to build a picture of their tolerance for change before we jump back into our kind of best practice engagement processes. I can't tell you what the final results of that are going to be, but certainly within the next few months, we're hoping to build a picture of their tolerance levels and begin engaging with them properly again. Next slide, please. So our business case scenarios, I thought it'd be interesting just to briefly let you know where we've got to on that. We've got 3 high-level scenarios that we think will make our assessment a little bit easier to manage for the reader, but also transparent as well. You know, we don't want to hide the fact that there is uncertainty here as well. Our scenarios are based partly on some 2030 scenarios modelled by TfL. We got lucky there. If you haven't got an organisation like TfL, or you know the similar organisations in Manchester, for example, who are producing this kind of data, then you may have to do it yourself. First scenario: return to business as usual. Economic growth, development growth goes quickly within the next kind of 12 to 24 months back to levels that we saw pre-COVID. We see total trips increasing at a level that we thought was going to happen before COVID. However, sustainable mode share is going up, and that's not a 20 percentage point increase, that's a 20% increase on previous levels. 20 percentage points would be truly astounding. But yeah, so we think actually in all of these scenarios there's going to be similar sustainable mode share increases. Again, that's more London centric. We think that's going to be driven as much by the mayor's transport policy as a COVID response and demand for active travel from, you know, from an effect where people are, you know, they try it out and they want to keep doing it. I'm not saying it's not going to happen. I just don't think it's going to be as big as the London-wide changes that we're seeing. There's a low growth scenario as well where we think it's going to take significantly longer, and by that I mean at least 5 years to go back to levels that we saw pre-COVID. Trips in the medium terms, you know, we certainly will see a lower amount of total trips happening within the area. And then the mid-range forecast it's a central forecast, which is in between the two. Just a warning about those is that we're still working on those percentages, so please don't take those away and try using those without doing your own due diligence. And we still have a job of work to do to assess our position after 2030, because we're looking at a 25 to 30 year lifespan for WPL. And finally, our economic case is going to have a great deal of sensitivity testing in it to try and deal also with this uncertainty. And one of those things that we will be testing is not just a range of charge rate levels, but a stepped charge rate level, and having a charge rate which we manipulate as the scheme goes on, as economic conditions return to normal. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Horace. Thanks, Mark. And apologies, we did lose Mark at the very end of his introductory session. We are running slightly over time, so I'm going to move straight on to the next presentation, and we'll pick up questions at the Q&A in 10 to 15 minutes. Do keep sending your questions through. We're starting to get to that. That's great. So our final speaker today is Sue Flack. Sue is Director of Sue Flack Consulting and has been advising a number of local authorities on their workplace parking levy schemes. Over to you, Sue.
Thanks, Nick. I'm actually stepping away from my consulting role for this presentation and moving into the realms of academia, which is something quite new for me. Next slide, please. So this presentation is about the social benefits of workplace parking levy. It's an attempt to look wider, really, and it's based on a paper which is hopefully going to be published soon, called The Social Benefits of Workplace Parking Levy, a Review and Future Research Direction. It's carried out, it's been written with Stephen Ison and Lucy Budd from De Montfort University, and Simon Dale from Nottingham City, who I think has been name checked a few times already on this session. And it is a research paper, it is a discussion paper, so there is a lot more to say about all these things. Next slide, please. So when a local authority first proposes workplace parking levy, it's easy to get overwhelmed by the objections, which tend to be focused around employers saying, why do we have to pay what they consider to be a tax, and employees saying pretty much the same thing. So the downside tends to get magnified, and this paper really is, as I say, it's the beginnings, it's the start of a discussion about what the upsides are. And this table, I'm not going to go through it all in detail, but it's interesting because what we've tried to do in this paper is identify some groups that are wider than just employers and employees that do stand to benefit from workplace parking levy. So just to give you a few examples in the following slides. So next slide, please. So the first area of benefits that we identified was better health and higher levels of well-being. So workplace parking levy provides money, and I take all that Harris has just said about COVID making the revenue streams very uncertain, and it may be that authorities have to redo their potential revenue estimates and take them down, but even so there still is some revenue in there, and that revenue can be put towards the climate emergency and air quality, and that means there's benefits for everybody in that. It helps to create the conditions where these things are easier to actually do. Some things that are perhaps under considered is that in doing workplace parking levy, it does mean that employers have to take more notice of the travel requirements of their employees. They have to think about them, and in many cases employers are doing that, and it's the nudge of the workplace parking levy just moves them on to consider those needs a bit more. So employees end up with their travel needs being better considered and better catered for in loads of different ways. The workplace parking levy normally goes into promoting healthier and safer options across the board, and with a bit of imagination it can contribute to a better work-life balance as well, and there's the other slides to talk about that a bit more too. So working from home can reduce the overall revenue, as Harris was saying, from workplace parking levy, but it can also improve work-life balance and can reduce the stresses of the commute. So next slide, please. So this is a greater sense of satisfaction with the local area. So the workplace parking levy provides funds for local traffic, local travel solutions. So more locally based walking and cycling alternatives, more potential reallocation of space, slightly more difficult, but it works with a parking constraint policy on new developments, and of course enables or helps to enable all those local improvements on streets that improves people's view of their neighbourhoods. Next slide, please. And going back to employers and employment, because there's a better transport choice, and as Harris was saying, transport choice is even more important now. So if you can improve the choice by means of infrastructure, but also by means of targeted incentives, then you can actually make work and training opportunities easier for people to get to. The next one I've got here are easier recruitment and retention for employers. And a lot of employers would argue it's the opposite to that because it causes a problem. But I think increasingly now, to be able to show that you've got a climate conscious, considerate travel policy for your employees is actually a good thing rather than a bad thing. And I think that's becoming increasingly apparent. And as Nigel said, employers are using workplace parking levy to support their own corporate policies, including better conditions for staff. I mentioned before that less commuting stress. So whether you continue to drive or whether you use other modes of transport, the levy contributes to the improvement of those other modes of transport, or contributes to the improvement of parking stress or congestion in the commute. And last but not least, and in Nottingham there have been some examples of this, it actually frees up space. So you can use ex-car parks, or you can use space on roads can be used to help with other policies like improving access to employment. Next slide, please. This is talking about COVID as part workplace parking levy as part of a COVID recovery plan. The levy can help with one of the key points of a COVID recovery plan, which is supporting a town centre or a city centre, because it supports all those things that themselves help to support the town centre. It doesn't affect parking that's for shopping purposes or parking for leisure purposes as a customer, but it does affect parking that can be swapped for public transport trips for commuters. By having a levy there, it encourages the policy process as well. So it encourages local transport plans and planning policies to be that much more ambitious, to have that much more impact. And at the same time, it can be tweaked to be fairer or to benefit particular types of people or particular groups that you want to be particularly focusing on. So it's got a lot of flexibility on how it works. I realise that my presentation is a bit relentlessly upbeat, but it's supposed to be that because the initial reactions to a workplace parking levy are often very downbeat. And so this is intended to balance that sort of atmosphere, to say, well, if you look wider and if you look longer, then the levy does have all these benefits. Next slide, please. So all of that, though, is subject to discussion. I'm sure some people will question it, and we are honest in the paper that we've written that we don't have all the evidence to back it up. So as is usual when you're talking about academic stuff, there's more research needed, including surveys of how people feel about the way that the situation is changing because of the levy, at work or in the shopping centre or whatever. We need to keep on working with the Department for Transport and with universities and with authorities to improve our base level of information and our base level of skills. And there are attempts to try to do that. And one of the things that would really help, I think, is outside London, the case for the workplace parking levy has to be approved by the Secretary of State for Transport. If the requirements for what the DFT requires, the actual requirements for a levy were more standardised in the form of guidance or some sort of framework, then it would be much easier to put a case together for why workplace parking levy is the right thing for any particular city. So I hope that served just to be a positive uplift at the end of the webinar, but also to get people thinking a bit about some wider benefits of the levy. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Sue, for that. Yes, very, very upbeat presentation on workplace levies. We are now just after 11:30, so what I might do is move us straight into our panel discussion Q&A with all our presenters today. So if I could ask everybody to rejoin the session. For fabulous and different perspectives on workplace levy. And we've got some great questions coming in from our attendees. So please do keep them coming in on the questions bar. They seem to be framed around three main areas. There's the sort of timing of this, and is this a bad time to proceed with such a scheme? Second area is the sort of context and the detail, so we'll cover that off, and then questions around the policy of a workplace levy. So we'll take the questions in that order, and we'll start with timing. And first question came in for Peter, and it was around the fact that is this the worst possible time to implement what will no doubt be seen by your businesses as another road tax and a business tax?
The response would be that it is the best possible time to consider ways in which we can improve the quality of public transport into our city, not just for people who work there, but for people who come here to shop and to enjoy leisure facilities and many of the other things that hopefully will soon be back in operation in our city. And really echoing what Sue was saying in her presentation, I think the challenge to us is to show the upside of the introduction of a levy as a leading discussion rather than the potential downsides for some. The benefits for us certainly far outweigh any of the disbenefits, and we've got to keep selling that.
Can I just say that when I used to work at Nottingham, and when we were considering imposing the levy, it was the time of the financial crisis in 2008 and 9. So, and basically, there's always something. Admittedly, there's not always something as bad as the current times, but there'll always be a reason for not doing it. And I think Sir Peter is right that you've got to look longer term, and you've got to put workplace parking levy in as part of a longer term plan, a longer term strategy.
As you might expect, Nick, I've obviously got the only database of workplace parking in the country, and I've obviously been keenly looking at it ever since the first lockdown. And employers have changed their behaviour radically over the course of the last 9 months or so. We had a very significant bounce back at the end of the first lockdown. Many employers went back to 100% of their previous numbers. Others have stayed very low. And I'm talking to a lot of employers, and it's fair to say there's a number of different options being considered. Nottingham City Council looking at future ways of working. And I think it also depends on the sector of business. Manufacturing by implication, you've got to have staff on site. But, we're keen to sort of share our knowledge in our database. If anybody wants any complementary or analytical work doing, I'm happy to hear from them.
Sure, and I suppose that's great, and that moves me on to another question that we got through from some of our registered attendees. In that, how do you account for that sort of change in occupancy and give I suppose the feasibility study some robustness given the uncertainty? We hear lots of modelers at the moment that say essentially just putting their traffic models in the bin because they can't really support what's going on now with the first lockdown, the second lockdown. So how can the data that you've collected, Nigel, give that certainty to some of the analytics that authorities will need to undertake to move the scheme forward?
Well, I think, as I alluded to in my presentation, Nick, we've developed this desk-based algorithm where it uses a number of different indices gathered locally, like Leicester have gathered information about typology of the employer, the standard industry classification, number of employees. We've actually done a comparison with the Nottingham database, and it's churned out a number of the anticipated liable pre-COVID, albeit, places that Leicester might get. I've been asked to do my own financial modelling. I've been asked to hold up a crystal ball and forecast for the next 3 years. I think hopefully the vaccine, I personally think by 3 years we might be at 70% of pre-COVID levels, which for us in Leicester is going to be generating, £9 to £10 million a year. So it's still a very, very significant income stream. COVID is the here and now. Poor air quality is the future. It's hundreds and thousands of years ahead. So when you put it in that sort of context, WPL should still be a really, really serious option for local authorities, I would suggest.
Thanks, Nigel. And sticking with timing, question for Mark and Harris. Why did it take so long to implement the scheme?
Well, we're just lazy down south.
I've asked that a few times too. Being an impatient politician, but I keep asking.
I mean, it is hideously complex, and I think Sue hit the nail on the head about standardisation and the importance of that. I mean, in my mind, when we first approached this, I thought it shouldn't really be any more complex than putting in a controlled parking zone. You know, we've been doing this sort of stuff for years in London, and yet, you know, several six figures of consultancy later, and we're still not at the position where we've sent the thing off to the DFT. So, I mean, Sue's point about standardisation, I think, should be a rallying call, because for as much as I think there is will out there, there's officer will, there's political will. When you're faced with this sort of level of uncertainty and level of work that's needed to get this business case across the line, you know, that is a significant barrier. And of course, the time it takes to move that through also gives space for other people to rally and object and derail and otherwise sort of frustrate the process. So it does take a long time. As you said, Nick, we were hoping that we would have our scheme approved, certainly locally and hopefully on the Mayor's desk by the end of this year. That's going to be pretty challenging, I think, but still aiming for it as best we can. And I think on the timing point that others have just made a comment on, yeah, I do think it is a good time for now. We're seeing a significant what we call a car-led recovery in London, and that is something that demands a policy response, because we simply can't go back to where we to where we were in February. You know, we must build back better, and workplace parking levy is part of that. What we have found, I know Harris picked up on this in the presentation, is that maybe the public transport, these big ticket items, I think they're still really important, but they may not be as important as some of the active travel and local implementation parts as well. So we've actually pivoted our scheme a little bit more to pick up some of those active travel improvements.
Yeah, that's Peter, you have something to say on the time it takes? On the time it takes to implement it.
Oh yeah, I was just remarking that you know, I've asked many times, you know, why on earth it takes a full electoral cycle at minimum in which to do it. But I've you know, had lots of explanations of it. I continue to be impatient, but it evidently does, and we need to do it properly. One of the things it is enabling us to do is to engage with business, and you know, it comes back to some of the earlier questions you know, that were being asked, you know, about, well, you know, is this the right time to do it? And interestingly, we have a joint chamber of commerce with Nottingham, and it's interesting that you know, from having been very, very sceptical when the Nottingham scheme was introduced, they've been very, very willing to engage with us. I mean, they're not saying that they're, you know, universally welcoming it. Of course they're not. You know, they're asking some very legitimate questions about how it'll operate and what impact it will have. But certainly the hostility that was there initially is not there with us here in Leicester. And perhaps, you know, taking some time to engage with them and with other key stakeholders is time that's going to be well spent.
Can I just say about the time it needs to develop the case and put the submission in? The trouble is, we don't know how long it should take to develop a case, because we only have one example. So we can only assume that what Nottingham did is what the DFT wants outside London. Inside London, there is Mayor's guidance, so you have slightly more understanding of what is required, that the Mayor decides on the scheme. But outside London and not in Scotland, the Secretary of State decides on the scheme. So all we can do is guess at what the Secretary of State would like to have in terms of justification. So it just backs up what I was saying and what Mark Frost was saying as well, that if we could have a push towards getting some government guidance on workplace parking levy schemes, that would be really helpful. And also, if we could encourage them to look at ways of streamlining the approval process, because one of the things that might drag the preparation process out is the time that DFT takes to decide on a scheme once it's submitted. So you could even argue that the workplace parking levy schemes shouldn't have to go to the Secretary of State, and that but that would take a change of legislation to achieve. So in the early stages, if we could push for some guidance and some streamlining from the government, that would really help, I think.
Sure,
Yeah,
sure.
building on that, Nick.
I mean, with COVID, sorry.
Yeah, Nick, if I could build on that, I think the meeting next week with the different authorities, and the local government association as well, and DFT, is key of actually clarifying what those points that Sue has made there. It's very important that we know the way forward. I mean, Sir Peter's given me a 3-line whip to deliver in quite a tight time scale. So for me, it needs to be clarified and very quickly.
Yeah, that's it. That's important. We lost a whole year with our final business case going to DFT, to the Secretary of State, and it would be good to have some clarity and some protocols within the DFT to turn it around a lot quicker. But internal council bureaucracy, I've been really impressed by the model they've got in Leicester with the city mayor in terms of the speed of decision making. Very, very different to Nottingham's, you know, so it's a real consideration, because Leicester have shaved off months because of their short lines of communication to getting approvals.
Sure, and we have seen some very quick decision making from government off the back of COVID. So hopefully they will use that ability to hopefully fast track some of the workplace levy decision making. That's great, thanks everyone. Moving on to some of the context and the detail of a scheme. I've had a few questions on the size of a scheme and the relative benefits or disbenefits against a larger citywide scheme against a smaller, more focused scheme. So I suppose if we want to start with the smaller scheme, Mark and Harris, is there anything we need to consider if we were putting together a very small focused scheme, you know, looking at very specific issues locally?
You may be on mute there, Mark, I'm afraid.
I'll kick off and then I'll pass over to Harris, who is a professional and won't be on mute. I mean, it is a challenge, Nick. So we had this very specific opportunity area with a very specific problem around public transport accessibility and capacity to be able to deliver the growth that the local plan and the Mayor's London plan wanted. And we had a solution for that area which predominantly benefited that area. So all of those things pointed towards quite a granular scheme, a small area. In fact, we even used the PL calculation for public transport access, so 960 metres, to effectively set the boundary of the levy for that section. I think that works relatively well, but it really only does so because we've got these two really massive anchor tenants, Sky-B and GSK, which really form 75% of the parking provision that's in that area. So, and we've got a very long relationship with both of those institutions. They're both relatively pro-sustainable transport, although they're not pro-tax. So, you know, there's still a challenge there, I think. But I mean, all those things pointed to why a smaller scheme in Hounslow might work. Of course, we've yet to really test that and to have those challenges and see whether we end up in judicial reviews and all the rest of it. But at the moment, that's not looking likely. So it's looking like we could get this across the line. The context for other parts of Hounslow is completely different. You know, we don't have interventions necessarily in parts of Cranford or Heston that would really justify us setting a levy across the whole of the borough. And of course, if you've not got those benefits, then it's very easy for a business to say, well, hang on a minute, I'm going to be paying X amount to park my car here, and what 25 metres across the road in Ealing or Hillingdon or Richmond, I'm not going to pay. And that's where you're going to end up in this sort of people picking off against local authorities. So I think it can work. There needs to be a very specific set of circumstances that leads you to having that sort of granular approach. Clearly, I think it's much better to have a citywide arrangement, but for London, of course, that would be hideously complex, and we weren't prepared to wait the 50 years that it would take to get to that point.
And I would add to that and say that if you do choose a smaller area, you're going to have to justify why you are applying the charge only to that area. And we ended up having to do a piece of work and another feasibility to demonstrate that the benefits of a WPL in an extended area were either difficult or diluted, and so it didn't make sense to expand the WPL. And what you may find, especially if you have a city or a region that is very different from one area to another, so if it's not just the city centre that you're talking about, something a bit more spread out, then you may find the benefits of the schemes that you introduce will not be even across the area. And so you might find yourself condensing that area to concentrate the benefits, because as you expand it, if you're going to charge everyone the same amount, then you need to make sure they're getting the same transport benefits, or to the same degree as the other areas. And as I say, we ended up having to do a piece of work to prove that we had chosen an area which was going to maximise those benefits, and that the areas around that section wouldn't benefit as much.
I mean, I'm not sure I totally agree with that, without being disrespectful. I mean, the beauty of the levy legislation, there's an awful lot of local decision-making flexibility. The Nottingham scheme covers a whole of our area. Not everybody benefits from the tram extension. Not everybody has the same degree of commercial bus operator supply in terms of routes. So that's a hard sell, and you're not going to please all the people all the time. But what you do is, the more you dilute a scheme, and we've got a relatively simple to operate scheme, the more you dilute that and start changing it, the more difficult it will be to enforce. And the other point I wanted to talk about was, Harris alluded to the potential of displaced parking in his presentation. That's obviously a very, very serious consideration, particularly for the politicians. What we didn't necessarily get right, but have since addressed, is have a complementary parking policy. So what I would advocate for every other authority thinking of having a levy, if they embark upon the process, have a complementary parking policy to have a look at displaced parking issues. The WPL in Nottingham has now funded a number of different traffic management schemes, and which doesn't mean that we stop parking, we limit it, we get a charge from it. And we've now got a six-figure revenue stream from on-street parking schemes. But a very, very important issue, particularly at a political perspective, is that of displaced parking.
Thanks, Nigel. Thanks, Harris and Mark. And Nigel, while I got you on, we've had a question around how many spaces do you think has been lost through your scheme with businesses removing them, and have you got any examples of the sort of uses they're putting those spaces to?
Well, in terms of land use, obviously I gave the example of Nottingham Trent University during the presentation, which is arguably the best example. But we've had other employers, again pre-COVID, who've reduced parking. It's allowed them to extend the actual operation of the business in terms of new buildings and stuff like that. I mean, we've seen massive variations in licenses through COVID. I mean, some employers are still providing a fraction of what they did before, less so with other employees. I mean, the academic institutions bounced back very significantly, but again, they've now reduced somewhat because of lockdown 3. It's a very fluid situation, but the point is we're still generating a very significant revenue stream. We've obviously revisited our financial model to address our financial commitments because of COVID, but fantastic flexibility with the scheme all round, and it shouldn't be a barrier, because it's about what are the aspirations for the city. You know, Peter knows what he wants to do to improve the health and welfare and the economy of his citizens. You know, COVID's hopefully short term. Severe poor air quality and deaths and everything else, that's long term, and let's not lose sight of the bigger picture.
I agree, and climate change as well. Harris, particular question to you. You mentioned the fact of employers paying the levy rather than employees, and you said it in such a way that was a negative. Does it really matter who pays the levy in terms of the scheme and your business case and the benefits of the scheme?
It matters to the businesses and the employees. So if the employer is going to pass on the charge, then there is an argument that it's going to make that employer, you know, less attractive, you know, within Hounslow. In terms of the scheme itself, it makes very little difference to the revenue stream where it comes from, if that was the focus of the question. But you know, we're trying to do this in partnership with the businesses, and you know, not just isolate ourselves. And we're trying not to remove ourselves from the issues that the scheme might cause the employers. You know, they want to be an employer of choice in their sector. But in terms of revenue, I think, yeah, there's an argument that it's not going to have a huge impact.
If I can just chip in on that, Nick. So when we were doing our transport studies that sort of underpinned the need for the infrastructure and ultimately for a WPL to fund that, there were some really interesting findings from that about how behaviour change happened in London in response to WPL, which suggested, I think I'm right in saying, Harris, 25% reduction in trips in the AM peak if and only if that charge was passed on to the employees. Now, I think it's fair to say that finding is not backed up by research that we've seen from Nottingham, but nonetheless, it's clear that if the employee is having to face this charge, then you know, there's greater chance of getting that sort of behaviour change. And as Nigel said, it's a very flexible scheme. So you know, whether we want to be in for the long term on this, I don't know, but you can look at things like EVs and dispensations, temporary sunset, with temporary dispensations with sunset clauses for classes of vehicles that we might consider to be more desirable, for example. So there's a lot of flexibility there, but I do think it's quite important potentially to pass that fee on. Otherwise, you just don't get some of those benefits of it as a policy tool rather than a financing tool. And ultimately, you want it to do both.
It was one of the first things that we said to employers, Nick, when we were engaging with them both ahead of the levy coming in and once it started, that this can be revenue neutral for you as an employer. You know, if you can actually pass it on to the actual user, the cause of the problem, and price point is very, very important. You know, in Nottingham City Council, I've got some people who pay twice the cost of the levy, but they choose to bring their car and park in Loxley House, our headquarters, which is right next to the train station and the tram stop. So they're going to pay a premium for doing so. So we actually say to employers, and we encourage employers to pass it on to the end user, because that's how you're going to really, really impact travel behaviour.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, that's great, and that does take us nicely on to the third topic of questions, which is around the policies behind the workplace levy, and schools has come up a couple of times. I know you mentioned NHS, Nigel, in your presentation. How do you address schools as a business, I suppose, in terms of teacher travel, let's say?
Yeah, schools are fully liable for the workplace parking levy in Nottingham. We had a very extensive consultation exercise, an examination in public in 2007 chaired by an independent travel planner. Schools were fully considered. I mean, Nottingham City Council at that time had an awful lot of local authority maintained schools, so it added to our level of liability. We've academised quite significantly still then, but if you, quite frankly, put in brass tacks, if you let schools park for free, you lose a massive income stream, and they are peak period commuters. It is, because that's the raison d'etre. This is to tackle commuting. It's a commuter congestion charge. You start exempting big swathes of people like schools, you know, you're actually almost self-defeating.
Yeah.
And there's always the angle that they've got to lead by example as well. You know, as councils, we have to lead by example, and schools are there to actually, and teachers in particular, are there to be the role models for their children. And this is what we're doing it for.
It also fits in with improvement plans around schools and school streets and school travel plans and all the rest of it. So it's part of a package.
Yeah, there is that hearts and minds.
Yeah, I mean,
you know, sorry, Sir Peter, please carry on.
No. I was just going to add that you know, obviously, you know, we're not at a position yet where we are having to take a decision, you know, whether to include schools or indeed the NHS. But certainly, the argument for including both is, to my mind, pretty overwhelming. but there is a debate yet to be had.
And it's about in your vision, have you catered for some of those groups in terms of active travel options? Your cycle routes, your pedestrian routes, your electrified public transport option, and Leicester doing all that in a very, very big way to minimise the arguments that you will get, because everybody wants what a WPL will deliver, but just nobody wants to pay for it.
Yeah, absolutely agree. When I was working in London for many years, I constantly had to bat off requests from schools for free on-street parking permits, for example, and these were for significant generators of traffic at peak time. So I can imagine that those sorts of arguments are going to be made for any workplace levy scheme. On the matter of active travel, which a few of you have picked up on that last chat, and I suppose it's around the prioritising the revenue spend and how are you going about that exercise, and ultimately are you involving the stakeholders who are paying into this pot? I'll open up to to everyone actually, given that you're all putting together quite different packages for delivery, be it trams, be it active travel. So just how are you going through that exercise and who are you involving? If anyone wants to start.
It's very important to get the stakeholders involved. If employers, for example, are bought into the vision of what the money is going to be spent on, the chances of working in cooperation, or at least working acceptably, are much increased. So employers at least, but other stakeholders as well. Employers have got to buy into the vision. It's got to be in consultation with them.
Yeah, that's exactly what we're doing. Yeah, we want the employers to have a say in the routes that we propose and the improvements that we make. We are prioritising routes that get their staff to transport hubs and retail hubs, and we want to introduce a very wide range of active travel schemes. Not just the infrastructure, although that is very important, but a full smarter travel program. And following recent legislation changes, talk to them about having an e-scooter network on site, potentially electric bike hire. But all of these things are to be discussed and to use their feedback on what their employees' issues are. To mould our response.
I should mention what Oxfordshire are proposing as well, as they're not on the panel. The proposal for Oxford is to charge the workplace parking levy in a particular area of Oxford, which is and to spend the money on a express bus route that particularly serves that area of Oxford, and at the same time to also incorporate discounted bus fares and discounted park and ride charges. So Oxfordshire are very much proposing a very sort of focused scheme, which is all about one area of the city, and they're really directing a lot of the benefits that come from the revenue plan back into that same area. So that's similar to what Harris is doing, but even more focused, I think. It's an example of what you can do, and we haven't actually talked about the potential for discounted public transport fares, but that is a possibility as long as it can be arranged within the legal framework, which is not an easy step in some cases.
No, certainly within Leicester, we've been engaging with business and other organisations for years through the Access Fund, through the local sustainable transport fund, but there's always been for us authorities some uncertainty on where that funding is coming from, and locally we haven't had the funding previously to do that type of work, which has been very, very well received. And certainly that's where Sir Peter has come to us and said, we need to protect that very important business to local authority communication channel. And it's a big cornerstone on why we're going forward with the WPL.
Yeah, it's absolutely important. sorry, absolutely important on the consultation, but what we've had in Nottingham, we started with a business support budget, which has now morphed in recent years to a workplace travel service, which is actually delivering first-class support, advice, guidance and money to get employers to improve their car park management, to encourage sustainable travel, to access grants, which we use with other money, and you can now get ultra-low emission charging points as a grant through the WPL, which is really, really important. And we do individual journey plans. You know, when people said the WPL, you'll get no new business, we had the world first as the home distribution centre. They could have gone anywhere in the world, but they came to Nottingham. You know, and we continue to support employers, and it's a relatively small amount in the scheme of what the levy generates, but it's been massively disproportionate in terms of the engagement successes it's delivered.
Thanks everyone. That's great. We're almost at 12:05 now, so we've overrun a little bit. And we've got lots more questions that we're not going to get to. So what we'll do is we'll try and pose those questions to panelists to get you responses to those specific questions. I suppose a final question that has come through for Peter is on the risk, on the political risk, I suppose, and is this an easier pill to swallow than other charging schemes like a congestion charge or indeed a clean air zone?
I think, you know, of course, I mean, you know, there's some downside to this from the political perspective, but the potential benefits to the city are so enormous, and therefore, you know, to you know, what you know, politicians can ultimately claim from it is, I think, absolutely overwhelming. And it's yeah, it's a risk that of course you know you weigh up and measure, but I have absolutely no doubt it's one that will pay off for the city, and you know, ultimately as a politician, I have to say for me, you know, I'm very happy to be associated with it. I won't go on about it too much, but that's one of the advantages of having a mayoral system of governance.
Thank you, Peter, and thank you, everyone. I suppose it just leaves me to say thank you to all our presenters today for some fabulous and informative sessions. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Nigel and Jason. Thank you, Harris and Mark, for your insights, and Sue. This, I suppose, just me then to wrap up and say that this webinar will be posted on social media channels in the next week or so. So any of you missed it, any colleagues missed it, they can watch it online along with the rest of the Land or Links series on a wide range of topics. And I look forward to watching workplace levies explode in the next few years across the UK and indeed internationally. Let's see where this innovative and policy can take us. So thank you to everyone, and please do